Biotech is the part of the market where hope becomes a business model, and sometimes where storytelling becomes a substitute for evidence. Every year, hundreds of biotech stocks spike on headlines and crash the moment real data shows up. Because in biotech, the line between optimism and misleading communication can be very thin. Today, I'll show you how drug development actually works, phase by phase, and why misunderstanding those phases is exactly how investors get pulled into hype cycles. And then, we'll look at real, documented case studies, where scientific uncertainty, selective reporting, and aggressive promotion collided with the market. Biotech is a strange, risky, and honestly fascinating territory of the stock market. It's where science meets capital, and human hope meets cold statistics. It's the world of companies promising breakthroughs for cancer, Alzheimer's, rare genetic diseases. It's the world of perfect-looking curves, confident press releases, and media headlines that sound like history is being made. But behind that facade is a different reality. The vast majority of drug programs never make it to market. Most biotech companies never commercialize a single approved product. Every year, countless stocks run up on narratives and collapse on trial data. And management teams can shape perception through statistics, trial design, and language. Meanwhile, retail investors, driven by headlines and emotion, can lose life-changing amounts of money. Biotech isn't just a market sector. It's a high-emotion machine built on the dream of saving lives. And that's exactly why it can become fertile ground for manipulation. To understand how this happens, we have to start at the beginning. How do medicines actually get made? Most people can repeat the words Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, but almost nobody understands what those phases really mean, because the reality is more complex, more expensive, and more brutal than any headline. How drugs are actually developed. The honest, clear picture you won't get from press releases. Developing a drug is a long, painful process, typically 8 to 12 years, often costing hundreds of millions of dollars. At each step, a candidate has to prove safety, efficacy, statistical significance, reproducibility, biological plausibility, and real advantage over existing options. But the key point is this: every phase eliminates most candidates. The further a drug goes, the fewer survive. And that's exactly why each phase creates opportunities for hype, selective framing, and sometimes outright misrepresentation. Preclinical, a factory of hope. Success rate often looks high on paper. Tests, cells plus animal models. The trap is simple. Almost everything works in mice. Preclinical work is the lab stage. A compound is tested in cell cultures, then in animals, often mice, sometimes rats or primates. If you've ever seen a headline like, "Drug kills 90% of cancer cells in mice," that's preclinical. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost anything can look impressive in mice. Why? Lab mice are genetically uniform. Tumors are often implanted, controlled, artificial models. Doses are optimized to produce a clean effect. Conditions are sterile, low variability, tightly managed. So preclinical isn't a real-world test. It's closer to a controlled demonstration. And companies can present it as the beginning of a revolution, even though it often tells you very little about whether it will work in humans. Phase 1. Not about effectiveness. Duration, 1 to 2 years. Participants, about 20 to 80. Goal, safety, toxicity, pharmacokinetics. Typical move to Phase 2. Many do, but many still fail later. Phase 1 is not about curing a disease. It's about survival. It answers questions like, does this drug cause dangerous side effects? What dose is tolerable? How does it move through the body? What's the safety profile? It does not need to prove that the drug works. So why do stocks often rise after Phase 1? because this is where language games begin. Instead of saying, "This drug was tolerated at 100 milligrams," some companies suggest, "Patients showed improvement and positive trends." That is not the same thing. Phase 1 usually cannot reliably establish efficacy, but investors who don't understand the process may hear improvement and assume breakthrough. This is often where early hype cycles begin. Phase 2, the most abused battleground. Duration, 2 to 3 years. Participants, 100 to 300. Goal, first real evidence it works. Outcomes, many fail. Phase 2 is the moment of truth. It's where you first see a control arm, placebo comparisons, randomization, statistical analysis that actually matters. And it's where most beautiful stories die, because humans are not mice. Human disease is more complex. Patients take other medications. Real tumors aren't artificial implants. Patients vary in age, genetics, health status. Biomarkers behave differently in messy reality. What worked in a dish can fall apart in humans. And this is where the darkest incentives emerge. P-hacking, endpoint switching, subgroup mining, and selective presentation. Let's be clear and fair. Not every Phase 2 disappointment is fraud. Biology fails all the time. But Phase 2 is where you can manufacture optimism if you try hard enough. Number 1. P-hacking and subgroup mining. Companies slice data into many subgroups and eventually find a pocket where something looks statistically significant by chance. A good analogy. If you shoot at a wall enough times, you'll eventually hit something, then draw a bullseye around it. Number 2. Endpoint switching. If the primary endpoint fails, you hear, "Secondary endpoints improved." Sometimes that matters. Often, it's a distraction. Number 3. Graph manipulation. Axes get cropped, scales get stretched, outliers disappear, error bars vanish. The chart becomes a marketing asset. Number 4. Open label tactics. No blinding, no placebo, no clean comparator, but lots of room for expectation effects and narrative control. Phase 2 is where a company often reveals its ethics. Do they follow the evidence, or do they sell the story? Phase 3, reality with no escape. Duration, 3 to 5 years. Participants, 500 to 3,000. Goal, confirm efficacy at scale. Outcome, success equals transformation, failure equals collapse. Phase 3 is the real exam, a chess match with no cheating. Why? Many trial sites, independent monitoring, strict statistical plans, large sample sizes, real-world patients, audits and documentation. Regulators demand complete data sets. At this stage, you typically can't hide failure inside a tiny subgroup. You can't quietly redefine endpoints. You can't play with design after the fact. You can't rely on a pretty chart. Phase 3 is where illusions often die. And it's also where you sometimes see companies delay, deflect, or avoid clarity. Because clear Phase 3 answers can destroy a narrative-driven business model. After Phase 3, companies go to the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the regulator that decides whether a drug can legally reach the market. The regulatory stage, FDA, as the final filter. After Phase 3, companies file with the FDA. Two common pathways: NDA, New Drug Application, typically for small molecules; BLA, Biologics License Application, for biologics like antibodies, vaccines, cell and gene therapies. At this point, the FDA reviews full datasets, protocols and analysis plans, safety signals, statistical rigor, and manufacturing quality systems. The FDA doesn't care about stories. It doesn't care about PR. It doesn't care about interviews. It cares about evidence. If evidence is weak or incomplete, outcomes can include CRL, complete response letter, effectively a rejection, or a request for major fixes. Clinical hold, a stop on trials until issues are resolved. In the market, these events can be devastating, sometimes overnight. How phases move stock prices. Here's the practical map investors should internalize. Preclinical, small moves, big hype, low information value. Phase 1, frequent spikes on vague language. Phase 2, the real coin flip, huge upside or catastrophic downside. Phase 3, success can re-rate an entire company. Failure can be fatal. FDA decision. Approval can lift valuation. Rejection can erase it. This is why biotech attracts both brilliant investors and endless hype cycles. Why investors need this framework? Because most of the scandals, investigations, pumps, and SEC actions in biotech are born right here, at the intersection of science, markets, and human hope. The SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, later brought charges related to alleged misleading statements and disclosures. Once you understand the phases, you understand everything. Why a company avoids Phase 3. Why it leans on open-label data. Why it celebrates subgroups. Why the charts look too perfect. Why the CEO talks about short attacks. Why you suddenly see a media blitz. And why the stock collapses overnight. Biotech deception isn't magic, it's a system, and it starts with investors not understanding what the phases actually mean. Real-world case studies. Biotech has press releases, conference presentations, and published papers, but the real story is often hidden between the lines. These aren't just timelines, they involve patients, careers, fortunes, and in some cases, regulatory and legal action. What I'm about to describe is based on publicly available reporting, regulatory statements, and documented controversies. And I'll be careful with language. I'm not claiming every failure is fraud. I'm showing patterns where promotion and evidence diverged. Case 1. Cassava Sciences, ticker SAVA. 2017 to 2024. Few stories are as instructive as Cassava Sciences. The company promoted a potential Alzheimer's therapy, one of the hardest, most expensive diseases in modern medicine. 2017 to 2019. Small company, low attention. Cassava existed for decades and over time received research support, including NIH-related funding. But their program raised questions in the scientific community. Small data sets, unusual mechanisms, limited independent replication, and controversies around certain figures and images, discussed by critics. The stock traded at low single digits, 2020 to 2021. The explosion. Cassava released open-label results, small, uncontrolled, not blinded, not randomized. But the narrative was powerful. Cognitive scores improved, forums lit up, media amplified, investors bought hope. The stock surged dramatically. 2021 to 2022. Scrutiny. Independent researchers and clinicians publicly raised concerns about aspects of the underlying scientific presentation, including alleged image irregularities, reported by third parties. Cassava disputed wrongdoing. Whether you view it as misconduct or methodological weakness, the key market point is this: controversy and lack of robust, controlled evidence were not consistent with the certainty implied by the hype. 2022 to 2024. Phase 3 reality. As later-stage results and external assessments emerged, the narrative weakened substantially. The stock retraced heavily. Lesson. When a company leans heavily on open-label results, promotes improvement without rigorous controls, and can't provide clean, replicated evidence, investors should assume extreme risk. and treat the story as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Case 2, CytoDyn, ticker CYDY, 2019 to 2023. If Cassava is a story about scientific controversy, CytoDyn is a story about promotion. CytoDyn's drug, leronlimab, had been explored for HIV. Then COVID happened, and suddenly the company positioned it as a potential COVID solution. 2020 to 2021. Media-first narrative. CytoDyn leaned into interviews, appearances, and emotional patient stories. The message was consistent. We're seeing strong improvements. But the evidence presented publicly was widely criticized as incomplete, non-representative, or selectively framed, often relying on analyses that lacked the clarity investors assumed. FDA rare public statement. At one point, the FDA issued an unusual public warning about how the company was communicating trial results, expressing concern that statements could mislead the public regarding the evidence. That kind of public FDA communication is rare, and it matters. Insider selling and SEC action. There were also reports and later regulatory allegations involving insider transactions and public statements. The SEC brought charges against company leadership related to alleged misleading statements and disclosures. Outcome: as the COVID narrative faded and trials failed to establish the promised benefits, the stock collapsed. Lesson: when promotion becomes louder than data and regulators step in to correct public messaging, investors should treat it as a major red flag. Case 3. Northwest Biotherapeutics, ticker NWBO, 2007 to 2023. This story isn't about a quick pump. It's about a slow, persistent cycle of expectation. Northwest Biotherapeutics promoted deceive-L, an immunotherapy approach for glioblastoma, an aggressive brain cancer with limited options. Years of data soon. Over many years, timelines shifted repeatedly. Investors heard versions of the same message. Results are coming. Analysis is being refined. Protocols are being adjusted. When results arrived, when publications and analyses did arrive, critics questioned aspects of design and interpretation, including control group choices and statistical methods. The broader point isn't to litigate every detail. It's that the clarity investors expected after so many years did not match the ambiguity of what was delivered. Lesson: when a biotech remains in almost there mode for a decade plus, without clean, definitive late-stage outcomes, investors should treat it as a high-risk narrative stock, not a mature clinical story. Case 4. Chiromic Biopharma, 2020 to 2022. This case isn't primarily about science. It's about disclosure and regulatory risk. Clinical hold. The FDA placed a clinical hold on parts of Chiromic's work, typically related to safety, documentation, or manufacturing questions. A clinical hold is material information. Markets react strongly because it can freeze progress. Allegations of non-disclosure. The SEC later alleged that the company failed to properly disclose the hold, while raising money and issuing optimistic statements. These are serious allegations, and the market outcome reflected that seriousness. Lesson: in biotech, regulatory status is not a footnote. It is the story. If disclosure is incomplete, everything else becomes questionable. Bridge. These cases are only the tip of the iceberg, but they show the same core dynamic. A narrative can live for years, until Phase 3, or the FDA, forces reality onto the balance sheet. How to spot biotech hype before it breaks. The pattern, not just the red flags. If you made it this far, you already understand the core truth. Biotech isn't only about medicine, it's about money, emotion, statistics, psychology, and communication. Many problematic biotech stories don't look like scams. They look like dreams, glossy decks, emotional patient anecdotes, beautiful curves, CEO interviews, promises of revolution. To recognize risk early, you need to see the pattern. Because the language and behavior repeat across companies like a template. Number 1. Companies with strong data often communicate calmly. Real science doesn't need poetry. Strong companies tend to publish controlled results, disclose statistics clearly, stick to predefined endpoints, engage regulators seriously, and build manufacturing readiness. Their tone is usually short, technical, and restrained. They don't say revolution. They say primary endpoint met. P-value 0.003. That's it. Number 2. The more emotional the messaging, the weaker the evidence often is. If you see weekly press releases, non-stop CEO interviews, a corporate Twitter running 24/7, constant words like breakthrough, exciting, game changer, potential, that doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it often signals that the company is selling a story, because it can't let the data speak for itself. Strong data sells itself. Number 3. The beautiful story, weak data rule. Here's a brutal rule of thumb. Real science often sounds boring. Weak science often sounds inspiring. When you hear revolutionary platform, first in class, without clear evidence, rewriting the rules, new era of medicine, treat it as marketing until proven otherwise. Number 4. When failure is explained with endless design nuances, it's usually over. A clean failure is simple. It didn't work. But a narrative-driven company often tries to bury failure under complexity. Center variability, unexpected baseline differences, endpoint redefinition, subtle patient selection issues, secondary trends. Sometimes nuance is real, but when excuses become the headline, that's a warning sign. Number 5. Subgroups, the favorite tool of narrative stocks. If the drug doesn't work broadly, companies look for a subgroup where it works. Over 65, under 70 kilograms, no diabetes, a certain biomarker slice. This is where p-hacking thrives. If you cut data into 50 pieces, something will look positive by chance. A real signal usually doesn't need a microscope to be seen. Number 6. Heavy reliance on open-label studies. Open-label means patients and researchers know what's being given. It's useful for certain questions, but it's weaker for proving efficacy. Open-label is easier to market because it's easier to generate positive narratives, but it's often a poor foundation for investor certainty. Number 7. Charts can be more misleading than press releases. Watch for cropped axes, missing error bars, smoothed curves, selective time windows, excluded patients with no clear explanation. A chart can create the feeling of efficacy, even when effect size is small or not clinically meaningful. Number 8. Short attack narratives. Healthy science can survive criticism. When a company responds to criticism by screaming short attack, attacking bloggers, blaming conspiracies, and acting like a cult, that doesn't prove fraud, but it's a major credibility warning. We saw versions of this pattern across multiple controversial biotech stories. Number 9. The celebrity CEO problem. In serious biotech, the CEO is busy with regulators, trial execution, manufacturing, scientific teams. When the CEO is everywhere, YouTube, podcasts, Twitter wars, Reddit, it often means the company is managing perception, not executing science. Number 10. Constantly changing indications. Oncology, COVID, autoimmune, rare disease, neurodegeneration. That's not innovation. That's a company shopping for the next sellable narrative. Real development takes years of focus on one mechanism. Number 11. A decade plus without definitive Phase 3 outcomes. If a company exists 10 or 15 years without clear Phase 3 results, it may be a permanent story stock. There are exceptions, but investors should ask, why is this taking so long? What exactly is the bottleneck? And where is the clean, definitive data set? Number 12. Vague safety language. Watch for coded phrases like, safety was consistent with expectations, adverse events were manageable, toxicity was transient. Sometimes that's normal phrasing, but if a company avoids specifics, you should assume the details are not flattering. Final conclusion. Biotech hype cycles look complex, but the mechanics are simple. When data is weak, the story gets louder. When there's no data, charts get prettier. When charts don't convince, subgroups appear. When subgroups fail, short attacks become the explanation. When the price falls, reverse splits happen. When cash runs low, dilution follows. This can last for years, sometimes decades. But the ending is usually the same. Phase 3, or the FDA, forces reality into the open. And if the effect was never real, the valuation collapses. Biotech is not evil. It's genius and risk side by side. Biotech has given the world CAR-T therapies, gene editing and gene therapies, personalized oncology, mRNA vaccines, life-changing treatments for rare diseases. Biotech is not bad, but next to real breakthroughs, there will always be people willing to sell hope as a product, using statistics, charts, and carefully written narratives. And yes, biotech can be one of the most profitable sectors on the market. It would be a mistake to view biotech only as manipulation and failure, because one real discovery can change medicine and generate extraordinary returns. We've seen companies that delivered real value and massive upside for investors, and we've seen companies where the story outran the evidence. That's why the goal of this channel isn't to scare you away from biotech. It's to teach you how to tell the difference between real innovation and a well-packaged delusion. Because biotech can change the world, and if you can separate science from theater, you can protect yourself from the worst traps and still be positioned for some of the best opportunities in modern markets.